ALEATORY podcast.
Have you ever actually stopped to think about the incredible, almost absurd amount of trust you place in the built environment every single day?
Oh, I mean, constantly. It's actually kind of terrifying if you dwell on it too much.
Right. Think about it for a moment. You walk down a busy city street, completely unbothered, while thousands of tons of concrete, steel, and glass just loom directly over your head.
Yeah, or, you drive your car across a suspension bridge.
Exactly. Suspended hundreds of feet above freezing, churning water, held up by steel cables you have never personally inspected, engineered by people you have never met.
And we just blindly trust it.
We really do. You stroll past towering cylindrical silos at industrial parks or massive concrete dams holding back entire lakes, and you never once flinch. We live our entire lives enveloped in this illusion of absolute safety.
We assume the energy is just permanently contained.
Yes, we assume the immense, latent, terrifying energy trapped inside these structures is securely, permanently contained. We treat potential energy like it is a myth, or at least, someone else's problem.
But potential energy is very real. I mean, it is a sleeping giant.
It is gravity, it is mass, it is pressure, all waiting patiently for a single microscopic point of failure.
Oh.
It just sits there, completely silent, in the form of a stretched steel cable,
Yeah.
or the reinforced concrete of a retaining wall, or, this is key for today, the riveted seam of a massive industrial holding tank.
And when that trust is broken, when the math fails, or the steel fatigues, or the sheer blinding greed of the people who built it finally catches up with reality, that sleeping giant wakes up.
It doesn't just fail quietly. It violently, catastrophically reclaims all of that stored energy in a fraction of a second. It is a terrifying thought, but it is the reality of the physical world we inhabit. Welcome to the episode. Together we turn knowledge into real results.
That illusion of safety is perhaps the most necessary psychological trick human beings play on themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if we constantly perceive the tension, the compression, the sheer forces quietly fighting a perpetual war against the materials we manufacture, we would literally never leave our homes.
We'd be paralyzed.
Exactly. But the physics govern our reality whether we acknowledge them or not. And today, we are examining one of the most surreal, devastating, and frankly historically consequential moments when that invisible war was lost in spectacular fashion.
So, to really understand the sheer magnitude of this failure, we have to immerse ourselves in the exact time and place. It is January of 1919.
Right.
We are in Boston, Massachusetts, specifically a neighborhood known as the North End. Now, if you visit Boston today, you probably picture the North End as this picturesque, heavily gentrified area, famous for incredible Italian restaurants, pastry shops, historical landmarks like the Paul Revere House.
It's very charming today.
Yeah, very charming. But in January 1919, this was a densely populated, gritty, bustling, working-class enclave. It was primarily home to a massive population of Italian immigrants.
These were families living in very cramped, cold-water tenement buildings.
Right. They worked the nearby docks, they loaded the freight trains, they worked in the factories. The sensory experience of this neighborhood was intense.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, the air tasted of salt from the harbor, but it was choked with coal smoke. The smell of horse manure from the delivery carts, and the heavy metallic stench of industry.
And you have to layer the profound historical anxiety of that specific month over the physical environment.
That's a great point.
Because the entire world was in a state of chaotic transition. The Great World War I had just ended 2 months prior, in November 1918.
So people were exhausted.
Beyond exhausted. Millions of soldiers were slowly returning home to a country that was completely drained. And on top of that, the deadly second wave of the Spanish flu pandemic had just ripped through dense neighborhoods exactly like the North End.
Leaving a fresh trail of trauma and empty chairs at dinner tables.
Exactly. Then there is the domestic political shockwave. The United States is bracing for a monumental cultural shift.
Prohibition.
Yes, the 18th Amendment is dominating the news. In fact, it would be officially ratified the very next day, January 16, 1919.
Wow, literally the next day.
Yeah, everyone knows the country is about to go completely dry, banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol.
So you have this exhausted, traumatized, yet frenzied working-class neighborhood. And looming quite literally over their homes, right there on Commercial Street near Keeney Square, was a monster of a structure.
A literal behemoth.
It belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of an industrial titan called the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA. This structure was a steel storage tank of almost incomprehensible proportions.
It really was.
I mean, imagine a cylinder 50 feet tall that's about 5 stories high and 90 feet in diameter. It was 283 feet in circumference. It just dominated the skyline of the waterfront.
And inside this hulking metal behemoth was up to 2.3 million gallons of molasses.
2.3 million gallons, which is a volume that the human brain kind of struggles to accurately visualize.
It is. I mean, 2.3 million gallons is enough to fill roughly 3.5 Olympic-sized swimming pools.
That is insane.
But we aren't talking about a municipal water supply. Molasses has a density of about 1.4 metric tons per cubic meter. It is 40% denser than water.
40% denser. Wow.
Yeah, so we are talking about roughly 14,000 tons of dark, sticky, suffocating liquid suspended in the air right next to residential tenements, public parks, and elevated commuter train tracks.
The sheer gravitational weight pressing down on the floor and the lower walls of that tank was astronomical. But, when I first read that, my immediate thought was, why molasses?
Right, it seems so odd.
Yeah, when we hear that word today, we think of baking. We think of gingerbread cookies or baked beans. It feels incredibly domestic and, harmless. Why would a massive industrial corporation need 3.5 Olympic swimming pools of baking syrup sitting on the Boston waterfront?
Well, because in 1919, molasses was not primarily a baking ingredient. It was the crucial raw material for a highly lucrative, entirely ruthless chemical industry.
Oh, interesting.
It all comes down to fermentation. Molasses is rich in sucrose and glucose, which means it can be fermented on an industrial scale to produce highly concentrated ethanol.
And they needed ethanol for the war.
Exactly. During the years of the First World War, the demand for industrial ethanol was absolutely insatiable. It was a critical chemical precursor required to manufacture modern munitions.
Wait, munitions? Like
Right.
explosives?
Yes. Without ethanol, you cannot synthesize nitroglycerin, you cannot produce smokeless powder, and you cannot manufacture high explosives for artillery shells.
So USIA was essentially a defense contractor.
Exactly. They were making an absolute fortune supplying the Allied war effort. Their supply chain was massive. They would bring in these colossal shipments of raw molasses from sugar plantations in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the West Indies.
And the ships would dock right there in Boston.
Right in the harbor. They'd pump the thick liquid into this holding tank in the north end, and then USIA would transfer it via a network of pipelines and rail cars over to their massive distillery in nearby Cambridge.
Where it was distilled into the chemical lifeblood of the war machine.
Exactly.
But here is the critical timeline issue that confused me at first. The armistice was signed in November 1918. The war is over. The demand for smokeless powder plummets overnight. So why, in January of 1919, is this massive tank still being filled to the absolute brim?
Well, this is where that looming shadow of prohibition dictates corporate behavior.
Oh, right, because of the ban.
Yeah, USIA saw the munitions market collapsing, but they saw another much shorter-term window of immense profit opening. If they could no longer manufacture explosives, they were going to manufacture rum.
Oh, of course.
With the 18th Amendment on the verge of ratification, there was going to be a one-year grace period before the actual enforcement of prohibition began in 1920.
So they had a deadline.
A huge deadline. The distilleries realized they had exactly 12 months to produce, bottle, and stockpile as much alcohol as mechanically possible before the industry was outlawed.
It was a sheer, unadulterated corporate frenzy.
They needed every single drop of molasses they could source. The holding tank on Commercial Street suddenly became the most critical, highly stressed bottleneck in their entire operation.
And, when a corporation is rushing to squeeze every last cent out of a closing window of profit, the first thing that disappears is safety.
Always.
But calling what happened with this tank cutting corners feels like a massive understatement. It is a masterclass in hubris. Let's look at the man who actually oversaw the construction of this tank back in 1915. His name was Arthur Gell.
Right, Arthur Gell.
He was the treasurer for USIA. He was a finance man, an accountant whose primary job was managing ledgers and cutting costs.
Let me guess, he had zero engineering experience.
Absolutely zero engineering experience. He was not an architect. He had no background in metallurgy or fluid dynamics. Yet this executive was handed total authority to construct a receptacle designed to hold 14,000 tons of fluid in the middle of a crowded city.
It just highlights a staggering failure of systemic oversight.
Yeah.
If you hire a professional structural engineer to design a holding tank, their very first priority is calculating the factor of safety.
Right, the margin for error.
Yes. This is a fundamental principle in engineering where a structure is intentionally over-designed to carry a load much greater than it will ever actually experience.
Just in case.
Exactly. To account for unpredictable variables, metal fatigue, extreme weather, minor construction flaws. But Arthur Gell didn't understand what a factor of safety was.
He just wanted it cheap.
His only directive to the Hammond Iron Works, the company contracted to assemble the tank, was to build it fast and build it cheap.
The details of the construction flaws are genuinely chilling. When modern forensic engineers look back at the schematics and the metal recovered from the site, the negligence is visible at a microscopic level.
Oh, it's appalling.
For a tank of that volume, holding a fluid 40% denser than water, the steel plating at the bottom where the hydrostatic pressure is at its absolute maximum needs to be incredibly thick.
Of course.
But Arthur Gell approved steel that was only half as thick as it needed to be. The bottom ring of the tank was only 0.67 inches thick.
That is paper thin for that much weight.
It gets worse. Even the dangerously inadequate engineering plans submitted to the city called for 0.687 inches. They literally shaved off fractions of an inch of steel just to save money on the materials.
And the thickness of the steel was only the beginning of the structural nightmare. The chemical composition of the metal itself was fundamentally flawed.
How so?
Well, it had critically low levels of an element called manganese. In steel production, manganese is an essential alloying agent. It improves the tensile strength of the steel, but more importantly, it reduces brittleness.
Okay, so without it, the steel is brittle.
Highly brittle, especially when exposed to cold temperatures. When high-quality, properly alloyed steel is put under immense stress, it yields. It stretches and bends slightly, absorbing the energy.
Like it has some give to it.
Yes.
Ah.
But when brittle steel is put under stress, it doesn't bend, it simply snaps. It fractures violently.
So it's like the difference between a rubber band and a dry twig.
Exactly. And then you have to consider how these brittle, paper-thin plates were held together. They used rivets, which was standard for the era, but the holes drilled for these rivets were completely wrong.
Let me guess. No reinforcement.
None. They weren't properly reinforced, which created massive stress concentrations around every single rivet. Every hole was essentially an invitation for a microcrack to form.
Which brings us to the testing phase. Before you pump millions of gallons of dense industrial fluid into a brand new tank, standard protocol requires a full hydrostatic test, right?
Yes, you fill the entire vessel to the brim with water. Water is less dense than molasses, but filling it completely tests every single seam. It tests the shear strength of the rivets, and it proves the foundation can bear a massive load.
But Arthur Gell bypassed this entirely.
He did what?
He ran a hose into the bottom of this 50-foot tank, filled it with a mere 6 inches of water, looked at it, and declared it structurally sound and ready for operation.
Wait, why would a company accept a groaning, leaking tank? I mean, 6 inches of water test aside, when they actually put molasses in it, didn't they see it failing? What are the hidden implications of just ignoring that?
That level of negligence is hard to wrap your head around, but you're right, the tank didn't just sit there in silence. It communicated its distress immediately.
So it was leaking from the start.
From the very first time they filled it in 1915, it leaked profusely. Witnesses from the neighborhood later testify that whenever the pumps were running and the molasses level rose, the entire 5-story structure would shudder.
A shuddering 5-story tank of syrup?
Yes, it emitted these deep, terrifying groans as the brittle steel strained against the rivets. The visual evidence of failure was undeniable. The seams wept constantly.
And people just walked by this.
Molasses would seep through the microscopic gaps between the steel plates and pool heavily at the concrete base of the tank. It was such a known issue in the neighborhood that local children would routinely walk over with little pails and teacups to scoop up the leaked syrup to take home to their mothers or to make candy.
That is horrifying.
The laborers working the nearby freight yards complained about the constant dripping. At one point, a USIA employee actually collected jagged, rusted shards of steel that had actively flaked off the inner walls of the tank, walked them into Arthur Gell's office, and dumped them on his desk as physical proof of an impending disaster.
And what did Gell do?
Gell's documented response was essentially, the tank still stands.
Unbelievable.
Instead of emptying the tank, bringing in structural engineers, or reinforcing the steel, USIA came up with a corporate PR solution. They painted the entire tank brown.
You're kidding. What are the hidden implications of painting it brown? Just to hide the leaks?
Exactly, to hide the leaks. They took this massive, groaning, bleeding structure and they covered it in a reddish-brown coat of paint simply to camouflage the dark molasses stains leaking from the seams. They literally painted over the warning signs.
So from 1915 to the end of 1918, the tank just sits there. It is loaded and emptied 29 separate times.
29 times.
But critically, it was rarely filled to its absolute maximum capacity. It survived those years purely by luck, accumulating microscopic fatigue cracks around those unreinforced rivet holes every single time it expanded and contracted. The sleeping giant was being poked over and over again.
And then we reached January of 1919. The environment and the chemistry suddenly aligned to create the ultimate catalyst. Let's look closely at the timeline between January 12th and January 15th.
Okay.
On the 12th, a massive tanker ship arrives in the freezing Boston harbor directly from Puerto Rico. It is carrying a fresh, enormous load of Caribbean molasses.
Right.
Now, to pump a substance as thick as molasses out of a ship's hold, through an underground pipe network, and up into a 50-foot storage tank, it cannot be cold.
No, it would be too thick.
You have to artificially heat the molasses using steam coils to lower its viscosity so it will flow through the pumps. So they begin pumping thousands of tons of this fresh, hot molasses into the commercial street tank.
But the tank is not empty. There is already a substantial volume of older molasses sitting at the bottom from previous shipments.
Right.
And remember the climate. It is the dead of winter in New England. The days leading up to this shipment had been bitterly cold. So you have this massive pool of near-freezing, highly viscous molasses at the bottom, and you are aggressively pumping millions of gallons of freshly heated, warm molasses directly on top of it.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. You are immediately introducing a profound thermal inequality within the structure of the liquid itself.
And then the weather outside experiences a wild, unseasonal shift. On January 14th, the ambient air temperature in Boston is a frigid minus 17 degrees Celsius, which is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But by the next morning, January 15th, a warm weather front sweeps in. The temperature spikes dramatically to 5 degrees Celsius, or 41 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a nearly 40-degree Fahrenheit swing in environmental temperature in less than 24 hours.
Wow.
What does that kind of thermal shock do to the organic material inside the tank?
It triggers a biological and chemical time bomb.
How so?
Molasses is not an inert fluid like water or motor oil. It is a complex organic mixture of sugars, primarily sucrose, glucose, and fructose. And living within that organic matrix are wild yeasts and active enzymes. The most critical player here is an enzyme called zymase.
Zymase?
Yes, zymase naturally acts as a catalyst for the fermentation of sugars.
I want to make sure the underlying chemistry is totally clear, because it's the invisible engine of the destruction. Zymase takes glucose, which has the chemical formula C6H12O6, and it breaks those molecular bonds apart.
Exactly.
The byproducts of this natural reaction are 2 molecules of ethanol, C2H5OH, and 2 molecules of carbon dioxide gas, CO2.
And that biological process is highly dependent on temperature. When the molasses was sitting at 2 degrees Fahrenheit, the yeast and the zymase were dormant. The fermentation reaction was barely occurring.
Because it was too cold.
Right. But consider what just happened over those 3 days. They infused the tank with thousands of tons of artificially heated liquid, and then the outside atmosphere rapidly warmed up, baking the steel walls.
Oh, wow.
This sudden, massive infusion of heat acted like an alarm clock for the biological processes inside. The zymase went into absolute overdrive, voraciously consuming the glucose and rapidly churning out ethanol and massive quantities of carbon dioxide gas.
I was trying to visualize what this actually looks like inside a sealed environment, and it's basically the exact same mechanics as a shaken bottle of champagne left out in the hot sun.
That is a perfect analogy.
If you have a bottle of champagne in the fridge, the liquid is cool, the dissolved carbon dioxide is stable, and the pressure on the glass is entirely manageable. But if you leave that bottle on a hot patio table, 2 things happen.
Right, the liquid expands.
First, the liquid itself undergoes thermal expansion. It physically increases in volume because it's getting warmer. Second, the heat agitates the dissolved gas, and the CO2 desperately wants to escape the liquid phase.
And it has nowhere to go.
In our Boston tank, you have the thermal expansion of 2.3 million gallons of heavy liquid pressing outward against the brittle steel. And simultaneously, you have the explosive outgassing of millions upon millions of tiny carbon dioxide bubbles forming deep within the viscous fluid, rising to the top and trapping themselves against the heavy steel roof of the tank, creating a massive, unvented pneumatic pressure chamber.
The sheer physics of the pressure bearing down on the base of that tank is staggering. We can look at the fundamental equation of fluid mechanics to calculate hydrostatic pressure. P equals rho times G times H.
Right, so P is the pressure we're trying to find. Rho is the density of the fluid.
Yes,
G is the acceleration due to gravity, and H is the height of the fluid column.
exactly. So if we plug in the specific numbers for the commercial street tank, the density of molasses is 1,420 kilograms per cubic meter. Gravity is a constant 9.8 meters per second squared. And because the tank had just been filled to maximum capacity, the height of the fluid is about 15 meters.
Okay, so multiplying those.
If you multiply 1420 by 9.8 by 15, you get over 208,740 pascals.
Which is an immense amount of force.
To put that in perspective, one standard atmosphere of pressure, the normal weight of the air all around us at sea level, is roughly 101,325 pascals.
So the pure liquid weight of the molasses alone was exerting over 2 entire atmospheres of crushing pressure at the very bottom ring of the tank.
Then you add the 1 atmosphere of ambient air pressure pushing down from above. That is 3 atmospheres of constant crushing outward force on the lowest steel plates.
Just continuously pressing on that thin steel.
And that number does not even begin to account for the rapidly building unvented carbon dioxide gas pressure pushing out uniformly in all directions. You have a vessel where the steel is half as thick as it should be. The metal is metallurgically brittle.
And the rivet holes are riddled with microscopic fatigue cracks from being loaded and unloaded 29 times over 4 years.
It was no longer a question of if the structure would fail. It was an absolute mathematical certainty. The sleeping giant was awake, pressing against the cage, just waiting for the final rivet to snap.
And that catastrophic failure occurs at exactly 12:30 UBM on Wednesday, January 15, 1919. It is a relatively mild winter afternoon. The neighborhood is active.
People are just going about their day.
City workers from the paving department are eating their lunch near the freight sheds. Children are playing in the streets. A local Boston police officer, Frank McManus, is making a routine call at a police box near the waterfront.
And then
He hears it. A deep guttural rumble that seems to emanate from the earth itself. People later described it sounding like the passing of an incredibly heavy, phantom elevated train. But there was no train on the tracks.
that deep, terrifying rumble was the acoustic signature of steel physically tearing apart.
The tank is unzipping.
The structural integrity of the tank had finally been violently exceeded by the internal pneumatic and hydrostatic pressure. Forensic engineers believe a massive fatigue crack, likely originating near a 20-inch manhole cover located at the base of the tank, suddenly propagated.
And because the steel lacked manganese and was fundamentally brittle, it did not stretch or yield gracefully.
It essentially unzipped.
The rumble is instantly followed by a sound that witnesses universally described as identical to a heavy machine gun firing. Rat-tat-tat-tat-tat.
Which is terrifying in 1919.
In January 1919, with a neighborhood full of soldiers who had just returned from the horrific trench warfare of Europe, that specific sound struck immediate primal terror into the streets. But it wasn't bullets.
No, it was the sound of thousands of flawed steel rivets instantly shearing off their heads and shooting out into the air like lethal shrapnel as the tank completely disintegrated.
In that terrifying microsecond, 14,000 tons of dense pressurized liquid, suspended 50 feet in the air, violently transformed its potential energy into kinetic energy.
The tank did not spring a leak. It explosively collapsed outward, and a 2.3 million gallon wave of dark molasses was unleashed upon the north end.
It is genuinely hard to picture the sheer apocalyptic scale of this wave. We're talking about a dark, churning wall of thick syrup that peaked between 25 and 40 feet high.
A wall of liquid as high as a professional football goalpost.
It was 160 feet wide.
Yeah.
And it was traveling outward at an astonishing 35 miles per hour. That is 50 feet every single second. Imagine a liquid wall of crushing weight moving toward you faster than an Olympic sprinter.
It's unfathomable. Furthermore, because the tank failure was an unconfined 360-degree radial release, the wave didn't just travel in one single direction like an ocean tsunami hitting a beach.
Right, it went everywhere.
It pushed outward in every direction simultaneously, acting like 4 separate towering walls of viscous liquid smashing across the wharf and deep into the grid of the city streets. And the destructive force was absolute. Because the molasses was 40% denser than water, it hit with a kinetic impact far deadlier than a typical flood. It simply pulverized the structures in its path.
The specific impacts on the surrounding buildings and the people caught in its path are absolutely horrific. Right next to the tank was the Engine 31 firehouse.
A sturdy building.
This wasn't a flimsy wooden shack. It was a reinforced municipal building. The wave hit it with such a concussive force that the firehouse was literally sheared off its foundation. The first floor completely collapsed in on itself, trapping the firemen inside under tons of brick, timber, and drowning syrup.
And the torn steel of the tank itself became part of the deadly arsenal.
The shrapnel.
As the wave exploded outward, it carried massive, jagged, razor-sharp sheets of the tank's hull on its crest, surfing them forward. One piece of steel shrapnel weighing 2.5 tons was propelled with such velocity that it smashed directly into the heavy support girders of the adjacent Boston Elevated Railway tracks on Atlantic Avenue.
That's a 2.5-ton piece of steel.
It sheared the heavy steel structural supports completely off, causing the train tracks above to buckle and droop violently toward the street, momentarily tipping a commuter streetcar off its rails.
Amidst this absolute apocalypse, there are these surreal, razor-thin margins of survival. Take a man named Harold Dorley, for instance.
Harold Dorley, right.
He was a 28-year-old freight agent from a nearby town. He was working in a wooden freight shed that sat maybe 10 or 15 feet away from the base of the tank. He heard the deep rumble, looked out the window, yelled, "Molasses tank gone," and the wave hit them.
And the shed was just gone.
The entire shed was obliterated into kindling. But somehow, by a matter of inches, the massive flying plates of steel missed Dorley and his clerks. They were completely engulfed in the darkness of the fluid, tumbled like clothes in a washing machine. But they survived.
But for many, there was no miracle. The descriptions from the first responders, the sailors from the USS Nantucket docked nearby, and the journalists who arrived on the scene are harrowing.
Truly harrowing.
They described a landscape that looked like a muddy, surreal war zone. Buildings were crushed up as though they were made of pasteboard, but the most terrifying aspect was the fluid itself.
Because it wasn't water.
No, the streets were flooded waist-deep in swirling, bubbling, brownish black syrup. Underneath the wreckage of houses and wagons, responders could see upheavals, a thrashing about in the sticky mass. It was impossible at first to tell if the struggling figure was an animal or a human being.
That is deeply unsettling.
The historical accounts explicitly note that the massive draft horses pulling freight wagons died like so many flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled to free their hooves, the deeper into the suffocating mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men, women, and children, suffered the exact same fate, trapped in an amber prison.
It's genuinely hard to sit with the terror of that afternoon. You have rescue workers wading into freeze-hardening syrup, frantically pulling people from the wreckage before they suffocate. It's an absolute nightmare.
But wait, how does this actually work mechanically? I mean, what are the hidden implications of a fluid acting like this? How does the thick, sticky syrup, something we literally use as a cultural metaphor for being incredibly slow, as in slow as molasses, how does that material suddenly act like a high-speed projectile, sweeping municipal buildings off their foundations at 35 miles an hour, and then turn into a hardened trap in a matter of minutes?
It's completely counterintuitive to our daily experience with liquids. The answer lies in a bizarre and fascinating subfield of physics called fluid dynamics. To understand how that molasses wave accelerated so violently and then trapped its victims so ruthlessly, you have to understand that molasses is what physicists classify as a non-Newtonian fluid.
Non-Newtonian. Okay, I was reading about this, and it blows my mind that the best way to understand this disaster is to think about ketchup.
Ketchup, yes.
When ketchup sits in the bottle on your table, it's basically a solid. You turn it upside down, and it refuses to pour. You have to smack the bottom of the bottle. You have to apply sudden physical stress to break down its internal structure so it flows. Is that essentially what happened when the tank burst?
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Water is a Newtonian fluid. Its viscosity, its thickness, or its resistance to flow remains completely constant regardless of the physical forces acting upon it.
So water is always water.
Whether water is sitting calmly in a glass or being blasted out of a high-pressure fire hose, its fundamental viscosity is the same. But a non-Newtonian fluid changes its viscosity under physical stress. Specifically, molasses, like ketchup, is a shear-thinning fluid.
Shear thinning.
When it is sitting at rest in the tank, it acts almost like a gelatinous solid. Its internal molecules are tangled together, resisting movement. But when you apply an immense shear stress to it, like the explosive concussive force of a bursting steel tank, you violently disrupt that internal molecular structure.
And thins out.
The friction between the molecules plummets. The fluid suddenly thins out and flows with incredibly low resistance.
So when that 50-foot tank violently tore open, releasing 14,000 tons of pressurized liquid in a microsecond, that immense explosive energy acted like someone violently smacking the bottom of a 2 million-gallon ketchup bottle. The sheer stress was so astronomical that the normally thick, goopy molasses instantly lost its high viscosity. It behaved much more like a high-speed, fast-flowing liquid, allowing it to accelerate to 35 miles per hour and race through the streets with the kinetic energy of a tsunami.
Spot on. But that sheer thinning behavior is what created their horrific death trap in the aftermath. The tragic flip side of this physics is what happens when the physical stress is removed.
When it stops moving.
Once the wave radiated outward, smashed into the buildings, lost its forward momentum, and finally stopped moving, the sheer stress disappeared. The molecular structure of the fluid immediately retangled. The molasses instantly returned to its highly viscous, gelatinous state. But it gets profoundly worse due to the thermal dynamics of that specific January afternoon.
Right, because the molasses had been artificially heated to pump it off the ships, but now it's exposed to the freezing Boston winter.
Yes. When the tank burst, this massive volume of warm liquid was suddenly spread out over several city blocks, maximizing its surface area exposure to the cold winter air.
Like a massive radiator.
And as the afternoon wore on and the sun began to set, temperatures dropped rapidly back toward freezing. The relationship between the viscosity of molasses and its temperature is extreme. Cooling molasses from 10 degrees Celsius down to 0 degrees Celsius increases its thickness by a massive factor of 3.
A factor of 3.
And as it cools further toward the freezing point, that increase in viscosity becomes exponential.
So you have a fluid that blasted through the neighborhood, acting like a high-speed liquid, knocking people down, sweeping them into basements. And then, the second it settled, it lost its sheer stress and rapidly cooled in the winter air, tripling in thickness. It literally turned the flooded streets into a suffocating amber concrete.
It paralyzed everyone. Victims were cemented into the rubble, unable to move their limbs to escape the rising tide of syrup. Rescuers were wading into waist-deep sludge that fought their every movement, pulling the boots right off their feet.
They couldn't even use water to wash it away, right?
No. They tried to use freshwater hoses from the city fire hydrants to wash the molasses away, but the cold water just cooled the syrup faster, making it thicker and harder to move.
That is just a compounding tragedy.
They eventually had to commandeer fireboats to pump briny, salty seawater directly from the harbor and mix it with sand just to create enough friction to begin cutting through the hardened mass to recover the bodies. It was a fluid dynamics nightmare that maximized the duration and severity of human suffering.
You know, it's hard to wrap your head around a thick liquid moving that violently and changing states that rapidly, but modern physicists actually study this exact phenomenon today.
Really, like with molasses.
Obviously, they aren't flooding cities with molasses to test it, but they study something incredibly similar: catastrophic mudslides and debris flows. There was a recent study published in the journal Frontiers in Physics focusing on something called Chengdu clay slurry, and it perfectly maps onto what happened in Boston.
Chengdu clay slurry, that is a phenomenal connection to make.
Yeah. The science of rheology, which is the study of the flow of matter, primarily in a liquid state, has advanced tremendously to understand exactly how seemingly solid earthen slopes suddenly turn into high-speed liquid avalanches.
Oh, like when a hillside just gives way.
Exactly. Debris flows, which are mudslides triggered by heavy rainfall or earthquakes, are essentially a thick mixture of fine-grained soil and water. They move together with massive rocks and trees, giving them characteristics of strong impact and immense destruction. Just like the Boston molasses wave, the flow behavior of a mudslide is completely controlled by the rheological properties of the fluid matrix.
Okay, I follow.
The researchers in the specific study wanted to pinpoint exactly the microsecond a thick mud transitions from a static, solid-like state sitting on a hillside to a violently flowing liquid state during a landslide and back to a solid state when it deposits at the bottom of the valley.
But wait, how do you accurately measure the exact moment a thick mud decides to become a high-speed liquid without just guessing?
The modern methodology is incredibly precise. The researchers used a highly advanced piece of equipment called an Anton Param MCR 301 rotary rheometer.
An Anton Pair MCR 301 rotary rheometer.
Okay. But they didn't just spin a standard metal cylinder inside a cup of mud. When you test hard particle suspensions like clay or thick organic syrups, you run into a physical problem called wall slip.
All slip. What is that?
This is where the fluid just slides smoothly against the smooth metal wall of the container instead of truly shearing and breaking down internally. To eliminate wall slip, the researchers used a specialized blade rotor system.
Okay, so a blade instead of a smooth cylinder.
Imagine four thin metal blades arranged at equal angles around a central axis, plunging down into the cup of clay. When this blade spins, it forces the shear stress to occur deep within the fluid itself, mud against mud, giving a much more accurate reading of its true internal viscosity and yield stress.
And they tested different thicknesses of the mud to see how it behaved under stress.
Yes. They prepared the Chengdu clay by soaking it for 48 hours to ensure complete saturation, and then they created slurries with varying solid volume concentrations. They tested everything from a very watery mixture that was only 9% solid matter all the way up to a thick, heavy mud that was 43% solid matter.
Okay, so they have a gradient of mud thicknesses.
Then they subjected these varying slurries to continuous shear tests. They slowly ramped up the rotation of the blade. This is the accelerated shear phase, which simulates the violent startup of a landslide or the explosive bursting of a steel tank.
Right.
Then they slowly decreased the rotation of the decelerating shear phase, simulating the wave losing energy and coming to a stop.
So if the mud was thick enough, like over 35% solid matter, the researchers saw something incredible. When they first tried to spin the blade, the mud fought back incredibly hard. It acted like a solid wall.
Yes, it resisted the shear.
But the second the spinning force crossed a certain threshold, the mud's internal structure essentially shattered. It gave up, the internal friction vanished, and it instantly turned into a fast-flowing liquid.
That threshold is called the static yield stress. It is the absolute maximum amount of force a substance can absorb before its internal bonds fail and it begins to flow.
Static yield stress.
The material experienced what rheologists call a stress overshoot, a massive peak in resistance, followed by a rapid exponential plummet in viscosity as it entered a stable, fast-flowing liquid state.
This modern study is the exact mechanical ghost of the molasses wave. Just like that highly concentrated clay slurry sitting on a hillside, the 2.3 million gallons of cold molasses had a massive static yield stress.
It wanted to stay put.
It wanted to remain a gelatinous, unmoving solid inside the tank. But when the massive fatigue crack propagated and the tank violently unzipped, the explosive release of 3 atmospheres of pneumatic and hydrostatic pressure applied a shear rate that instantly exceeded the syrup's static yield stress limit.
In a fraction of a second.
In a fraction of a second, the internal molecular resistance of the molasses shattered. It experienced that stress overshoot, its viscosity plummeted, and it surged outward at 35 miles per hour.
And the connection holds brutally true for the aftermath as well. In the Chengdu clay study, during the decelerating shear phase, as the blade rotation slowed down, the shear stress decreased and the viscosity climbed back up.
Meaning it thickened again.
The researchers noted that the dynamic yield stress, the point where the moving liquid solidifies again, was much lower than the initial static yield stress. In the streets of Boston, once the waves smashed into the firehouse, snapped the elevated train supports, and spread out over the blocks, it lost its explosive kinetic energy.
The shear rate dropped to 0.
The dynamic yield stress took over, the internal molecules linked back together, the viscosity skyrocketed, aided severely by the freezing ambient temperatures, and the liquid returned to a static, concrete-like state.
The precise physics of a modern, deadly mudslide perfectly map onto the mechanics of a century-old industrial disaster.
It is a brilliant, terrifying connection that shows how inescapable physics truly is.
So you have this perfect storm of arrogant industrial negligence, basic thermodynamics, and non-Newtonian fluid dynamics converging at 12:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. The physical toll is staggering. 21 men, women, and children are dead. 150 people are seriously, permanently injured. A massive swath of a major American city is flattened into a sticky wasteland.
And as the dust settles and the agonizing cleanup begins with fireboats and salt water, the inevitable question arises from the surviving community.
Who is going to pay for this?
Exactly. Who is at fault? This brings us to the massive legal battle that dominated Boston for the next 6 years.
The aftermath of the Great Molasses Flood triggered one of the most exhaustive, fiercely fought, and consequential legal proceedings in American history. It was a massive class action lawsuit known formally as Doar v. United States Industrial Alcohol Company.
119 plaintiffs, including severely injured victims, widows of the deceased, and people whose businesses and homes were destroyed, banded together to sue USIA.
Because the sheer volume of claims and technical evidence was so overwhelming, The Massachusetts Superior Court appointed a man named Hugh W. Ogden to preside over the hearings as a special auditor, essentially acting as a judge to determine liability before it went to a jury.
And Ogden was a respected military man, a former colonel, and a meticulous state auditor.
Now, if you look at this from the perspective of USIA, an industrial giant with bottomless pockets, they are not going to walk into a courtroom and simply admit that their corporate treasurer designed a paper-thin tank to save a few dollars.
Never.
They're going to mount an aggressive, highly funded defense. And in 1919, they had a deeply convenient, culturally resonant scapegoat immediately available to them.
They argued in court that the tank did not fail due to structural weakness. They claimed it was sabotaged.
Wow.
They claimed it was bombed by Italian anarchists.
And honestly, we have to look objectively at how highly plausible that specific defense sounded to a jury and the general public in 1919. It wasn't just a desperate corporate lie. It was a narrative deeply rooted in the severe political paranoia of the era.
Right. The historical context makes it a brilliant legal strategy. It is the absolute height of the first Red Scare.
There are massive, violent labor strikes happening all over the country.
And there is a rampant, heavily documented anti-immigrant sentiment sweeping the nation, particularly directed at the Italian community in places exactly like the North End, who were frequently and unfairly stereotyped as radical political agitators.
Furthermore, there actually was a violent, highly active anarchist movement operating at the time, known as the Galleanists. They were actively conducting bombing campaigns against government buildings, judges, and corporate targets.
So USIA's high-priced defense attorneys wove a very compelling narrative. They argued that because USIA was producing industrial alcohol that was used for the war effort, even though the war had just ended, they were a prime, highly visible target for anti-war or anti-capitalist terrorists.
They suggested that an anarchist had crept down to the waterfront and thrown a dynamite pipe bomb at the base of the tank.
But wait, didn't the defense have actual eyewitness testimony to support the explosion theory? I mean, the Boston police officer on the scene, Frank McManus, and several other survivors testified under oath that right before the wave hit, they heard a loud rumble followed by a sound like a machine gun or a massive thunderclap-like bang.
Right.
If you are sitting on a jury and you know anarchists are throwing bombs in your city, and multiple witnesses say they heard a loud bang and machine gun fire right before the tank exploded, it sounds exactly like a terrorist attack. USIA essentially argued they were the victims of terrorism, not the perpetrators of negligence.
It was a fiercely contested debate. USIA spent over $50,000, which was an absolute fortune in 1919, equivalent to nearly $1 million today, just on expert witness fees to push this sabotage theory.
$1 million just on experts.
They brought in explosives experts from the military to testify that a bomb could have caused the rupture. But Hugh W. Ogden, the auditor, was not swayed by the political hysteria. He mounted an incredibly rigorous 3-year investigation. He listened to more than 3,000 witnesses.
3,000.
He examined 1,500 exhibits. He oversaw cross-examinations of the finest engineers in the country. And he systematically, empirically dismantled USIA's anarchist theory.
But how did he actually prove a negative? How did he prove there wasn't a bomb when the entire structure was obliterated?
Through an exhaustive forensic analysis of the physical evidence left behind. First, Ogden noted that despite sifting through the wreckage for months, investigators found absolutely zero physical evidence of high explosives.
Nothing at all.
There were no bomb fragments, no timing mechanisms, no chemical residue of dynamite or black powder, and critically, no scorch marks or explosive pitting on any of the recovered steel panels.
An explosion of that magnitude would have left chemical and thermal scars on the metal.
There were none.
But what about the witness testimony? How did Ogden explain away the loud bang and the machine gun sounds that terrified the neighborhood?
Ogden allowed brilliant engineering experts to take the stand and explain the acoustic reality of structural failure. They testified that the massive thunderclap bang was not a bomb. It was the catastrophic, supersonic sound of the thickest steel at the base of the tank suddenly yielding and tearing in half.
Wow. And the machine gun sound?
And the machine gun sound was the rapid, sequential shearing of thousands of heavy steel rivets popping out of their holes as the immense pressure unzipped the panels. The sounds were evidence of failure, not sabotage.
The forensic analysis of the steel itself was the absolute nail in the coffin for the corporation, though.
It was undeniable.
Engineering experts brought the steel into laboratories and proved to the court that the tank's walls were up to 50% thinner than the standard, accepted engineering practices required for a vessel of that massive volume.
50%.
They proved through metallurgical testing that the steel lacked manganese and was highly brittle. They painstakingly traced the origin of the failure to that massive fatigue crack near the 20-inch manhole cover at the base of the tank, demonstrating how the steel had been cyclically stressed beyond its physical limits every single time the tank was filled and emptied over those 4 years.
And then the plaintiffs dragged Arthur Gill's actions directly into the light of the courtroom. The cross-examinations must have been brutal.
Oh, I'm sure they were.
They proved on the record that USIA had engaged no one with any architectural or structural engineering expertise to review the blueprints. They proved that Gell had actively skipped the vital full-capacity water tests.
And the paint.
Yes, they presented witness after witness who testified that the tank groaned and leaked profusely from day one, that children scooped molasses from the base, and that the company's only structural remediation was to order a crew to paint the tank brown to hide the stains.
Hugh W. Ogden was a conservative military man. By all accounts, he likely harbored a natural political sympathy for big business and a disdain for government interference.
Right.
But he was also a man deeply committed to facts, evidence, and justice. He saw past the highly funded Red Scare smokescreen and recognized a textbook, undeniable case of legal corporate negligence.
Ogden ruled comprehensively against the corporation. He found USIA fully and completely at fault for the structural failure of the tank and the resulting devastation.
And the financial penalty.
He forced the company to pay out over $600,000 in damages and settlements, which is equivalent to roughly $12 to $15 million in today's money. The victims' families received about $7,000 each for the loss of a life.
It was a massive financial blow to the company. But when we look back at this from a century away, the financial settlement isn't the most important outcome. All of these incredible details, the molecular fermentation, the non-Newtonian fluid dynamics, the metallurgical failure, the courtroom drama, they all converge to create the world we physically inhabit today.
The true, enduring legacy of the Great Molasses Flood is not just that it was a bizarre historical footnote or a dark punchline about a slow-moving syrup. It is the absolute foundation of modern civic and structural safety.
This single devastating disaster forced the end of the laissez-faire era, where big business operated without government oversight and without legal consequences. It proved that the American legal and regulatory system could actually hold monolithic corporations accountable for their hubris.
It's terrifying to think about, but before this flood, you did not even need an approved building permit or an architect's sign-off to construct a 50-foot tank of dense industrial liquid in the middle of a crowded residential neighborhood, simply because the city technically classified it as a receptacle, not a building.
That loophole is just mind-boggling.
After this flood, the regulatory landscape changed overnight. This disaster birthed the strict legal requirement for professional licensed engineering stamps on all structural plans.
It triggered the sudden, mandatory promulgation of rigorous building codes, municipal zoning laws, and exhaustive safety testing protocols across the state of Massachusetts, which rapidly rippled out to become the standard across the entire nation.
It also demonstrated the profound power of the modern class action lawsuit to give ordinary, working-class citizens a collective voice and legal leverage against immense wealth.
The 21 men, women, and children who tragically drowned or were crushed on that January afternoon did not die in vain. Their terrible loss bought the rigorous safety regulations, the mandatory building permits, and the structural engineering standards that currently protect your own home, your own city, and your own life today.
It is a sobering, vital reminder that nearly every single line in a municipal safety manual, every critical clause in a modern building code, is written in blood.
The illusion of safety we talked about at the very beginning of this exploration is not magic. It is maintained only through the constant vigilance, the math, and the strict laws that were born directly from the wreckage of preventable disasters exactly like this one.
I want to leave you with a final haunting image to mull over on your own as you walk through your city today. Decades after the wreckage of the North End was finally cleared away, the torn steel hauled off for scrap, and the court case is permanently settled, the physical memory of the disaster stubbornly refused to fade from the environment of Boston.
The smell.
Into the 1950s and 1960s, long after the neighborhood had been rebuilt, utility workers going down to read gas meters in the dark, damp basements of the North End reported something eerie.
What did they find?
On hot, humid summer days, When the temperature rose and ancient substances vaporized more readily from the brick and earth, the air in those old cellars would still carry the distinct, sweet, suffocating scent of dark molasses.
That is just chilling.
It is a sensory reminder that the past never truly evaporates. The sweet ghost of the molasses flood lingered in the air, just as the invisible scars of history live on inside the concrete, the steel, and the rigid building codes of the modern world surrounding you.
It really makes you look at the buildings around you differently.
We want to thank you, the audience, for giving us your time today. If you found value in this exploration, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Check the description below for reference links to more information. Until next time, keep elevating your mind.
ALEATORY podcast.